have Andre Calmon from the College of Business, and I have to say this whenever I introduce Andre, we're kind of following the same path. We both did our PhD in operations research at MIT. We both went to INSEAD in France as assistant professors to the same group. And then we both came here to Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business as late-stage assistant professors. He's doing very interesting work, and generally I would characterize Andre's work as motivated by business model innovation, and specifically for environmental and social impact. And what's pretty exciting is how he blends his teaching with his research. So this project and some others, some other papers, actually came out from a business model innovation class where students started startups. Startups were successful. They started facing questions about how they should operate, and then he turned them into papers, and now it's working on publishing alongside with helping and mentoring those students in their businesses. So very cool model.
Okay, cool. Thanks, folks, for coming. Again, Carol, thanks for the invitation. It's cool to be here in an interdisciplinary crowd and to have a little bit of an opportunity to share my research. So today I'm going to talk and dive into a paper called Business Model Innovation for Ambulance Systems in Developing Countries, Coordination and Competition. This is joint work with a fairly large team. So this was the job market paper. And I don't know if it's like this in your field, but in our field, our students go to the academic job market with a job market paper, kind of like economics in OM. So this was the job market paper of a former postdoc of mine called Andre Calmon. He's now a professor at Logistics University in Antwerp. Andre Calmon is me. And it's also joint work with Gonzalo Romero, who's a professor at the University of Toronto, and Luc Van Bastenhoven, who is a professor, now emeritus professor at INSEAD. And the story for today, as Beryl hinted at, is a story about a paper, about a research project, but it's also the story of a startup called Stampless that was founded by these three guys, Pradeep Singh, Antoine Poisson, and Jose Leon. They were three students of mine about 5 years ago in an MBA class on operations management at INSEAD. Every class that I teach, students at the end of the class need to come up with a new business model. And usually encourage them to think about a business model that's simultaneously more profitable and more sustainable than whatever exists today. And the idea that these three guys came up with was a company called Stampless. Stampless, in a nutshell, is basically Uber for ambulances in India. I'll give a little bit of motivation. In a bit, as I said, it started as a class project in the MBA OM class. And the big innovation that they had, this is a picture of them winning the INSEAD startup competition. And the big pitch for their startup is to create something for ambulances, an Uber for ambulances with a twist, where they do something called a Platform Plus, which we'll investigate more throughout the hour, which is really a platform. You can think about it as an Uber-type platform matching riders to drivers, in this case patients, to ambulance providers, but they add their own ambulances as flexible capacity. And this company has grown over the last few years. As you can imagine, they really grew up exponentially during COVID in India. And nowadays they have over 300 ambulances in their network. They've raised about $40 million in investment. So they have a valuation of about $150 million. So we're going to go into what is this business model, why is it sustainable or not, and what can we learn from this type of business model. To set the tone a little bit and talk a little bit about the context where this research and this project comes from, let me talk a little bit about how emergency response systems, in particular ambulance systems, look like in a lot of developing countries. So in a lot of developing countries, there's no 911. So in places like India, most of Sub-Saharan Africa, there is no public ambulance response system. If there is a public ambulance response system, it's usually very ineffective. So if you look again at the way ambulance systems in a lot of developing countries look like, first of all, there's two characteristics. Number one thing is that in a lot of places, there's a lack of ambulances. So the WHO recommends one ambulance for 25,000 people. This is a little bit of an arbitrary number. Of course, it depends on road networks, it depends on where you are. But if you look at places like Kenya, for example, they'll talk about another project later in the talk related to this. There's about one ambulance for every 150,000 people, so very much below. We're not even counting road infrastructure than the WHO recommendation. And if you look at places like India, for example, what you'll see is a lot of discrepancy. In cities like Hyderabad, where Stamford operates, you will have enough ambulances to meet the WHO criteria. In other areas, if you kind of quickly move away from urban centers, you won't have enough ambulances to satisfy them. So in a lot of developing countries, the first issue is lack of ambulances. The second issue in a lot of these countries is, even if there are enough ambulances, which is the case of Hyderabad, it's the case of certain regions in India, these ambulances will not be coordinated. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, as I said, there's no centralized 911 dispatch system. So if you have colleagues from India, for example, you can ask them how they deal with emergency response in their hometowns. A lot of times, like in my home country, in Brazil, for example, it's similar to this as well. I'm Brazilian originally. What happens is that you don't really trust the public 911 number, and what you end up doing is that you have a bunch of phone numbers of ambulance providers, kind of like plumbers on your fridge, that when there's an emergency, you start calling these numbers and see if there's any ambulance available. In places like India, usually what happens is that you have hospitals, clinics, independent providers, each with one or two ambulances, usually stationed around the hospital, trying to get calls. And as again, a lot of these calls that they're trying to get are non-emergency calls, because for a lot of these providers, emergency calls are actually not very profitable. Most of their money comes from non-emergency calls. Is this clear? So lack of ambulances and lack of ambulance coordinations. So the result of both of these things are long wait times. In a lot of regions in the world, people simply do not trust ambulance systems. The wait time for an ambulance is hours or around an hour. And it's very likely that even if you call a provider, if you have a number, that they'll have an ambulance that's available and close to you. So again, what is the status quo of this market? So again, in the absence of coordination, let me make this crystal clear. What are the dynamics of this market? And again, for those of you who might not be super familiar with game theory, usually the way that we can think about this model as some sort of spatial game and some sort of spatial dynamics between ambulance players, ambulance providers, and patients. So what is the status quo of this ambulance market before a startup enters? So what's the status quo of this ambulance market? Usually what happens is that you'll have a bunch of different providers, each one like the green provider, the red provider, the blue provider, each one of them with a few ambulances. An accident might happen. If you are within range, so this patient will be in an accident, they won't have complete information of where these ambulances are. They'll call one of the providers. If the provider they call has an ambulance in range, then you'll receive a response. So let's say that this accident happened within range of red ambulances or one of the ambulances of the red provider. Your call will be answered. If you call the provider and no call is answered, that's not good. Maybe your call is lost. Maybe you don't have other numbers. Maybe you'll just find an alternative means to go to the hospital. For the purposes of this paper, we're going to assume that if you call a provider and there's no ambulance available, this call is lost. Again, everything that I'm going to say today can be generalized to this case of multiple calls.
Can I have a question here?
Yeah.
Probably out of scope of your paper, but
No, sure.
Since there is a solution to this in the developed world, what is the barrier to not to adopt that?
Should have like the public ambulance systems? Yeah, that's a great question. So there is a solution to this problem. The government could just come out and create its own ambulance system. There's a few reasons why that doesn't happen. In many regions of the world, governments are just underfunded, and there's no kind of public. So there's a few layers to that question. In a lot of cases, there's just not enough money to buy ambulances. In places like Kenya, for example, that's something that's going to happen. So you just don't have enough funds or organizational capacity for the federal government or even the city government to set up a response like that at a scale that's needed. In India, it's a similar thing. A lot of cities in India have a 911 type number, but they're not particularly effective. And it's also coupled to the fact that a lot of these developing countries, a lot of these countries in like sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, They just don't have public healthcare systems or public healthcare systems that actually work. So everything is productized for the get-go. But I think that's a good question. You know, I think the end state of all of these things will be some sort of publicly funded or publicly subsidized or kind of public-private partnership. But the truth is that that hasn't happened. It probably won't happen in the next 10 years. So that kind of motivates why we're looking at business models that can be deployed right now. In places like Brazil, for example, there's a hybrid. What happens is that you have a baseline 911 number that doesn't really work that well, but kind of works. And then on top of that, most people have private insurance, and then they have access to private ambulances and stuff like that. So there are places that have a two-tier system. But you're right, there is a solution to this problem. And there's deeper questions of why these solutions are not applied. But again, the status quo of these markets look like this. Uncoordination, a few ambulances per provider. You're in an accident, you're going to call one of the ambulance providers. If there's someone available, that's great. However, if you call someone that's not available, then tough luck. You're going to have to either call someone else or for the purposes of our discussion, the call is lost. Questions about this, about the status quo? Okay, so there's been 3 different business models. So, you know, the market has come in to fill this gap. And what we've seen in developing countries is 3 types of business models that have emerged to try to improve the level of, or the quality of emergency response and non-emergency response in emergency response systems. One is that you have a bunch of startups that are emerging that just try to come into a market and compete with existing providers. So in this first picture, you can think about this gold provider that just comes in, sets up its own ambulance systems, tries to, you know, take out some market share, and overall, you hope that the response time will improve for customers. An example of a company that does this is Falk. Falk is a Norwegian company that their business model is going into developing countries, buying ambulances and trying to do response. A second, recently in the last 5 years, a second model that has emerged and has become pretty popular is companies that come in and instead of adding their own ambulances, what they do is that they set up a platform and they try to coordinate existing providers, very much like Uber for ambulances. An example of a company that I'm going to talk, we're also doing research with, and I'll talk more about it in the end of the talk, is a company called Flare. We're doing more data-driven research with them, and Flare is based in Nairobi. They're also created by MBA students, and they basically have a platform that tries to coordinate existing providers. What StanPlus is doing is what we think is an interesting business model, is that they do something called a platform plus, where they have a platform, so they try to coordinate existing providers, but on top of that, they have platform-owned ambulances. So they have their own assets that they try to use as flexible capacity in this market. So these are the 3 business models that we've been seeing emerge in developing countries to try to fill this gap for public response. And why did StanPlus create a platform plus, right? So why did they decide to add their own ambulances? They call it red ambulances. So this is Prapip and Jose Leon with one of the red ambulances. It's their brand of ambulances on their platform. And for a few different reasons. The way that Uber tries to match supply and demand is by doing dynamic pricing, is by doing surge pricing. All of us probably already paid a little bit more money on surge pricing on Uber or Lyft. For emergency responses, you can't really do that, right? You can't really do dynamic pricing because when there's an accident, there's legal reasons or ethical reasons. None of these companies, all of these companies that are the platforms of developing countries for ambulances, they're big on transparent pricing. So they can't really say, okay, there's an accident, we have no ambulance available, you're going to have to pay 3 or 4 times as much for a ride, especially because the patient might not even be in the condition to respond. The second is that response time is of the utmost importance. And if you've taken any operations management class, you know that you need flexibility, reactive capacity in order to be able to have fast response times. A third reason is that demand is very uncertain. So usually when you have a lot of uncertainty and you want low response times, you need to have low utilization of your assets. So what ends up happening here is because demand is uncertain utilization, you want to have flexible assets Most ambulances get only 1 or 2 calls a day. Usually they're not in the place that you want unless you own that ambulance. So you got to have your own assets. And the 4th reason is related to this, because if you own your own ambulances, you can tell the ambulances what to do. You can place them wherever you want in the city in a way that maximizes your response time or accomplishes your objectives. So again, there's a few different reasons why Stampless created this Platform Plus. And over time, this is data up until January 2019. This is all the data that I can show from them. But you see that while most of their ambulances, the bottom of this bar are the ambulances that are on their kind of platform that they don't own. But over time, they've been slowly and surely adding some more and more ambulances that they own as flexible capacity. However, adding this platform-owned ambulances has some downsides. And the main downside has been for other providers. So this is a picture of an article that came out in India, in a big newspaper, of ambulance providers actually protesting against Stampless. So they're saying down red ambulances because they perceive that this creates an unfair competition with them, because you have a platform that has their own ambulances and they might use this to just take away market share, take away rides from the existing providers. So Stampless has found this model difficult to deploy in some regions, and this is where they approach me again to say, okay, we need some help with just organizing and articulating what are the strategic benefits of what we're doing, who's better off, who's worse off. How can, before thinking about incentive design and more concrete analytics and incentives and experiments, how can we just start thinking about the forces in this market and use it to refine, in their case, their own pitch for investors. Okay, so this is when this classroom project that became a startup came back to me and became a research project. And Stampless approached me and approached this team that I'm working with a few strategic questions. First was, how much coverage can the status quo provide? How good can we really think about what's the limits of by coverage? I mean, if you have demand for ambulance calls distributed in the city, what fraction of those calls can the status quo without coordination capture? The second question that they had is, once you have the status quo and an entrepreneur enters, right? So if you have a new player coming into this market, which is the case of, for example, Falk, Flare, and Stampless, how does this change the incentives that existing providers have to add more ambulances? How does it change your coverage? The third question that they had is, how do different business models influence patient welfare? Are patients better off or worse off? And how can we compare a for-profit platform, they're very much for-profit, with a government-run platform? How can we think about the difference in coverage between having a non-profit platform versus a for-profit platform? And the last question that they asked is, how does these different business models affect existing ambulance providers' profits? Are ambulance providers better off, worse off? How do these things look like? So these are the research questions we look at this paper, in this first paper. And later I'm going to talk more about how we translate the theory to practice. Any questions so far, or clarification things about the context? Okay, so let's dive into how we think about this situation. So our very first attempt to organize in our own minds how this market works, how the different dynamics work, was to create a very stylized game theory model. So our first approach was not to use data, it was to create a very stylized model to just think about what are some potential trade-offs, what are some of the forces that act in this market. So really taking kind of this microeconomic approach. And I want to share this with you for a little bit. And the challenges of thinking about this setting is coming up with a model that describes in a reasonable way, and by reasonable I mean a way that's anchored in well-accepted modeling methodologies in the literature, the status quo. So the status quo before an entrepreneur enters, and then think about how the status quo, so this will be the game we're going to play. We're going to describe a model that describes we're going to introduce a model that describes the status quo equilibrium of this market, and then we're going to disturb this equilibrium, assuming that an entrepreneur enters the market as either a competitor, as a platform, or as a platform plus. And then for each strategy that a new entrepreneur uses, we're going to see how this equilibrium changes. based on how this equilibrium changes, we're going to see the implications for coverage and various providers. So let me go through what our status quo model is, some of the results that we have. I'm not going to dive into the math particularly deeply. I'm just going to describe our model. You can look at the map in the paper. I'm also going to skip the competitor case. It's also in the paper. The paper is available online because the platform and Platform Plus are more interesting. After that, I'm going to go back and we're going to discuss how we're working with another company called Flare to implement some of these ideas in practice. So let me start off describing a very stylized setting to start giving us intuition into how to model this setup. Okay, so there's not a lot of game theory models that describe ambulance platforms out there in the literature. So if we want to build such a model, there's a few things that we need to choose. This model has to have a few ingredients. The first ingredient is how do patients choose providers? So how do consumers engage? How can we model customer behavior in this platform? How do patients choose providers? So that's on the demand side. On the supply side, we need to model somehow how do providers choose to enter the market? How do we think about the strategy for providers entering the market? How do providers, the next stage is how do providers allocate calls to ambulances? So basically, does an existing provider, if the red provider gets a call, how do they think about allocating this call to their ambulances? And finally, how do the providers or existing providers make capacity decisions? How do providers choose the number of ambulances that they'll have? So these are the main decisions that any reasonable model needs to capture. Getting a little bit more technical, the way that we're going to model customer choice is using a classic choice model called the multinomial legit model. It's a very complicated way to just say that patients will choose different providers according to a utility function, part of which you know, part of which you don't know. We're going to assume a free entry model into the market. This means that basically providers will keep entering the market until the total number of providers in the market will be defined by a free entry model, which means that providers will keep entering the market until the marginal value of the next provider entering the market is 0. We're going to assume that ambulances are allocated providers are allocating calls to ambulances in the closest available ambulance strategy. Again, this is what all providers, it's not a profit maximizing allocation. It's always the closest available allocation. Again, we talked to like 5 or 6 different companies in the space, and all of them do closest available when it's an emergency. They see the cost of having not meeting an emergency higher than trying to maximize their own profits. And then we assume that the capacity decision of these providers is indeed profit maximizing. So these are the main ingredients of our model. Multinomial legit choice model, a free entry model for the number of providers, closest available dispatch, and a profit maximizing total capacity decision. Yes?
So for that closest match, is there a time dimension or dimension?
There's just a spatial dimension in our case. Well, there's a temporal dimension that, I'll explain that in a sec, that we're going to assume that ambulances will be available as a fraction of the time. But given that there's an ambulance available, or multiple ambulances available within range of a customer or a patient, you'll just dispatch other services.
Multiple requests, say, emerge in some time period, you would just consider like a first come, first serve.
Yeah, basically. Oh, yeah, but yes, and in the paper we're extending this direction. I'm going to show something even simpler here, where I'm just going to show a spatial equilibrium model. So just to make it very, very easy, very intuitive. Even then, the model is pretty complicated. So how we're going to model this setup? We're going to assume that demand is uniformly distributed over a certain region, and that the total demand is normalized to weather. The simplest way to think about this is that imagine that we have a city that's a circle, and that's enough to get a lot of our insights. So imagine that we have a city that's a circle. It's called this in economics. It's called the Salop model. We're going to assume that the price of an emergency ride is fixed at a price P per ride. Again, very simple. And now the key thing is that we're going to assume that the probability that a provider's ambulance cannot respond within a reasonable time is Q. What does this mean? This means that if you have a provider, let's say with 2 ambulances, that are uniformly distributed across the city, or they can even be distributed in a more clever way, but just thinking about it being uniformly distributed across the city, that each ambulance will have a range that it can respond to of 1 minus q. Another way to think about this is that the circle would be like the hours of the day, and 1 minus q is the time of the day that that ambulance is available. But again, very, very simple model. We're just assuming that the probability that an ambulance can respond within a reasonable time is 1 minus q, that it cannot respond is q. And why are we using this 1 minus q as a probability of response? Because if you have X ambulances, if a provider has X ambulances, the probability that this provider will be able to answer a call will be 1 minus q to the power X. So this is just the probability that a provider will have an ambulance, at least one ambulance in range and ready to respond to. What's important about this function is that all results hold as long as you have this idea of limited coverage and a coverage that's increasing in the number of ambulances. As long as these things are going in the right direction, our results will hold. So, and we're going to assume that a caller is going to call one of the providers. If there is an ambulance in range, the call is responded to. If not, the call is lost. So again, if there's an accident that happens, you call one of the providers. If the provider has an ambulance in range, they're able to respond to you. This happens with probability, in this case, 1 minus q squared. If it doesn't, the call is lost. Yes?
So I can understand the simplicity for simplicity reasons. The model is like a provider customer.
Yeah.
But there is a very critical issue here, right? The time dimension, or like not only the time dimension, but losing a call is not just losing a call, right?
Yeah, so I'm not modeling the cost of losing a call yet. We're just assuming that it's going to be lost. But the time dimension, again, the spatial dimension dominates usually in these cases because for emergencies, a lot of these ambulances only get 1 or 2 calls per day. So, but you can think about Q as an availability of an ambulance. But what we're not modeling in this case, the big thing that's not here, we're not modeling the dynamics in the sense that an ambulance might be busy with a patient and another patient arrives calling for the same ambulance. That we're not modeling. And one way to skirt around that is that utilization is low, but usually in these spatial models, just the availability of the ambulance and where it's located is what dominates. So you can think about Q as just a probability that if you call a provider, one of their ambulances is unavailable. So that's Q. I called someone overall in aggregate, what's the probability of that? One of the ambulances being available, any given ambulance being available, it's 1 minus Q. What's the probability that at least one ambulance is available? It's 1 minus Q to the number of ambulances. So there's different ways that you can interpret Q. This is not just the elegant one, but at the end of the day, what matters for the model is this idea that the more ambulances you have, the more likely one will be available, and that any given ambulance is not always available. So this is one. So again, how does this look with multiple providers? The way that it works is that an accident happens. You're going to call one of the providers with some probability. This provider will have an ambulance available for you. This probability is increasing in the number of ambulances they have. And if the contacted provider has an ambulance available, the call is answered. If not, the call is lost. So again, you're going to call one of the providers. If there's an ambulance available, the call is answered. If not, the call is lost. So why am I making all these assumptions? Because this gives us a very natural expression for the percentage of calls that are answered. So the percentage of calls that will be answered will be just the probability of a provider calling one of a patient or someone that suffered an accident, calling one of the providers times the probability that that provider will have an ambulance available. And in our model, another advantage of this is that this term, this coverage, the probability that your call will be answered, or the average probability in the market that the call is answered, it will be proportional to customer welfare. So this coverage will be proportional in equilibrium always to the welfare of customers. So I'm going to use these two terms interchangeably in this talk. So again, this is how we're modeling response. A provider will dispatch the closest ambulance, and you can think about it mathematically as just having a probability that a provider that you call has an ambulance available, and this probability being increasing in the number of ambulances. How do we model consumer choice? We assume that patients receive a value B from an ambulance call.
from an ambulance ride. So you receive some value from an ambulance ride. This could be a very high value. And you pay a price P per ambulance ride. This means that the expected net value from calling a provider is just V minus P. So this is your net benefit times the probability that the provider has an ambulance available. And we're going to assume a customer utility function that has this log shape. So you can think about this as a risk-averse utility function from economics. But basically, we're going to assume this utility function where you have log the net value of an expected value of a ride plus some unknown component. I'm going to call this an epsilon. Why do we have the log? Exactly because if a provider has no ambulances, or if the probability of response of an ambulance is 0, basically this means that the customer derives negative infinity utility from calling that provider. So basically it means that like there's no point in calling a provider that for sure will be out of range or has no ambulances. So I guess it goes back to your point that we're leaving this, an ambulance not being available as part of the customer choice model. So in this case, the benefit of this is that if you assume an extreme value distribution for this noise, which is common in the literature, this becomes a multinomial legit model, where patients will call customers proportional to their probability of responding. Again, very stylized, but we map it back to this classic choice model in the literature, which is the multinomial legit model. So we solved decisions, basically the dynamics of calls and matching to patients to providers. We modeled customer choice. The next ingredient is figuring out capacity decisions. How do providers choose how many ambulances they're going to buy? And that we're going to assume that it's done in a profit maximizing way. We're going to assume simply that the cost of adding an ambulance is C. The provider has some profit pi, and they're going to maximize their profit, which is just the revenue that they get by the fraction of the calls that they respond to, minus the cost of adding ambulances. This becomes just a math formula, and we're going to assume that they're going to be maximizing this profit. So they're going to do a profit maximizing capacity decision. Again, common assumption, this is what we see in practice as well. Finally, we're going to assume that the number of providers in the market, not just their capacities, but the number of providers in the market is through a free entry model. So the number of providers in the market is endogenously defined as well, and it's determined through a free entry model. By free entry model, it means that providers will keep entering the market until their expected profit is 0. So it's going to be a lot of competition in the market. And there's a big advantage of all this homework that we just did. And this is the challenge of doing this type of model, is that we endogenize everything. Everything is endogenous to the model. We endogenize customer decisions. We endogenize allocation decisions. We endogenize the capacity decisions of the providers. We endogenize the number of providers in the market. So we get a model that's very complicated at its core because there's a lot of moving parts that are interfering with each other. But the exogenous variables in this model are just 3. They're going to be the probability that any given ambulance is unavailable, Q, the price of a ride, P, and the cost of adding an ambulance, C. So what's going to be interesting here is that, and we're going to have this term Z, which is the profit potential. It's like the ratio between P minus the log of Q. Minus the log of Q is positive. Remember that Q is between 0 and 1, divided by a cost C. And basically, this is a measure of the profit potential of the market. This term is just the marginal revenue that the first ambulance that gets into the market makes. So it's kind of the potential revenue that you can make in the market. The higher the price of an ambulance, the lower the probability that an ambulance is unavailable. The higher the profit, the higher the cost of an ambulance, the lower the profit. And we're going to assume that this quantity is greater than 1. That means that at least 1 ambulance will enter the market. So again, we did all this work to come up with a model that's grounded in literature, that can be completely characterized by really what is a single variable, which is this profit potential on the market. And once we have that, we can actually write down the equilibrium of this market. By equilibrium, we're just describing exactly in stylized setting what's happening with the status quo. So we can, and this requires some math that I'm not showing here, that if it's profitable for at least 1 ambulance to enter the market, there is going to be a unique pure strategy equilibrium. So there's going to be an equilibrium of the number of providers in this market, and we can characterize in closed form the number of ambulances and the number of providers. The second thing that we learn in this market is that when we have these conditions, this consumer choice model, free entry model, profit maximizing capacity decisions, you will never answer more than 71% of the calls. So there's a strict upper bound of the number of calls that are answered in this market. So again, in this setting where everything is endogenous, everyone is making these decisions in the way that we described. In the stylized circle city, only 71% of the calls will be answered. For us, this was a cool result because in a lot of these game theory models, it's really hard to get these upper bounds. Like what is the worst case or the best case in this case that you can get. And in this case, I'm claiming that even as profits go to infinity, you'll answer at most 71% of the calls, which is, at least from a stylized setting, an indication that we need new business models. So if the status quo is insufficient, that answers our first research question, at least theoretically. Okay, so given the status, yeah.
So the value call market potential.
Yeah.
Can you think of it as a population density, or?
Yeah, you can think about that because it will depend. Well, I don't know if I can display that here. You can think about it as a population density because that will affect Q, for example. But we say profit potential because it's in the model. It's literally what it is. It's like the marginal profit. Yeah.
So you may have answered the question, and this is from a perspective of somebody who knows nothing about this. But you talked about as profit is approaching infinity, but maybe you're saying it's profit potential.
Profit potential. Yeah, profit potential. Like profit potential.
Answer my question. I was going to say, is there a way for it to be 100%?
No.
Where that profit is not right at that.
Not in equilibrium, not in this model, because it's the profit potential. I might have misspoken. Because the profit potential, because what happens? It's a free entry model. So the higher the profit potential of the market, more people will enter, more competition you'll have. The lower the profit each person will get. So it's, from biology, it's literally like those population competition models, but in a much more, in a way, kind of more stylized way, but it's the same idea. So even if the profit potential goes to infinity, because it's a free entry model, there'll be more competition, which in turn kind of disincentivizes more people to go in, and this creates a cap on the coverage. Okay, so what do we do now? So now let's see what happens when an entrepreneur enters the market. So now the market is in equilibrium. We set up this little nice mathematical equilibrium in this object that we're calling this ambulance market. Now we're going to disturb this equilibrium with different providers coming into the market with different business models. I'm going to skip the competition, a competitor. I'm going to just talk about the platform plus, because these are the most modern model. So what are we going to assume? We're going to assume that the market has a given profit potential, that it's in a given status quo equilibrium with a given number of providers, and each provider with a given number of ambulances. We're going to assume, for again the purposes of this presentation, that existing providers can add ambulances if they want. They can also reduce the number of ambulances that they have. We're going to assume that they can reduce the number of ambulances that they have at no cost. That you can just leave your ambulance in a ditch somewhere and keep moving on with your life. You can assume that they make money if they sell their ambulances. You can assume that there's a cost for them disposing their ambulances. But as long as the revenue that they make from disposing ambulances is less than the cost of the new ambulances, all our results hold. And we're going to assume for the stock that no new providers enter the platform in response to the entrepreneur. In the paper, we have an extension where we let the number of providers change, but it's it gets messy. But for now, we're going to assume no new providers enter, and we're going to assume that the right of the price doesn't change. Because those are regular. So, okay, so an entrepreneur enters as a platform. So what does this mean? The entrepreneur will enter as a platform coordinating existing providers. And so it coordinates existing providers. We're going to assume that the platform shares a fraction of the revenue of a ride. So it does like what Uber does. It charges a cut of the ride for as a fee for using the platform. Providers can join the platform or not. So providers can choose to join or stay independent. Or is the fraction of the revenue charged for each provider is chosen by the platform. And providers may acquire additional ambulances or can reduce their ambulances if they want. And we're going to assume that the ambulance dispatches the closest available, the platform dispatches the closest available ambulance to accidents. All companies we know do this. So again, it's more or less a realistic setting. You're going to come in, it's going to be a revenue sharing contract. People can add ambulances or not, they can join the platform or not, it's up to them. What happens in equilibrium in this case? Okay, so we're going to add an additional parameter to describe the platform power. And this is going to be this platform beta. Beta will be the capacity of coordinate, can be thought of as the capacity of the platform to coordinate the markets. You can think about it as the pooling coefficient in this probability that a provider will have an ambulance available. If beta is high, this means that the platform has a lot of power and can kind of distribute these ambulances uniformly throughout the city. So basically you're getting the full advantages of coverage. If beta is low, this means that you can't really coordinate these ambulances, and ambulances tend to be in the same place around the city. Why did we do this? This is because in Hyderabad and Nairobi, where we have data, ambulances tend to bunch together. They tend to be bunched together around hospitals because it's where they get non-emergency calls. But again, you can think about beta as a single parameter that describes how well the platform can spread out these ambulances in the city. And the platform can choose how many providers it will bring into the platform will choose how many providers it will bring into the platform, and also commission rate bar that it will choose in order to maximize its profits. Okay, so in this setting, it becomes a really, really complicated, non-convex optimization problem. It has several constraints. So for those of you who are not familiar with game theory, the way game theory works is that you literally formulate this big, complicated equilibrium in the market as a giant optimization problem. Usually these optimization problems are non-convex. So you need to do a lot of work to try to say anything about them. Luckily, in this case, we can sort through the math because my co-authors are really smart, and we can describe the equilibrium in this case, or at least a range of number of existing providers in the platform, in the market. Okay, so what's the equilibrium once this platform enters? First of all, everyone will join the platform, so there is an incentive for the provider to set or for everyone to join the platform. And however, the downside is that there will be no incentive in this market for existing providers to buy ambulances. So what will happen is that all existing providers will join the platform, but no existing providers will add more ambulances. The proof is basically showing that given a status quo equilibrium, given a market profit potential or of market profitability, that if you attract K people to the platform, it's always more profitable to attract K plus 1 up until everyone joins the platform. Again, the proof is in the paper. It takes several pages. You need to show that a certain optimization problem isn't feasible. But again, everyone joins the platform. So what does this mean in terms of insights? So given our bound of 71%, what we find is that if there's a little bit of coordination capability of the platform, coverage can increase by a lot. Just by having this platform come in, if there's even some coordination capability, beta is 2. Again, beta is the ability of this platform to spread people uniformly around the city, or increase the probability that you'll get a response. A little bit of coverage will go a long way. This is a well-known result in operations. A little bit of flexibility gives you a lot. However, there's no incentive for fleet expansion in this case. And there might still be a somewhat significant coverage gap for moderate pooling if you can't do a lot of pooling, a lot of coordination with these providers. We can also compare this case with a nonprofit platform. What we're doing here is that I'm looking at the coverage of a platform that is nonprofit. So this would be a platform that doesn't take any share of the revenue of a call. It just gives everything for the providers. Versus a for-profit platform. So you can think about this as the coverage of or the probability of a call being answered of a government-run platform versus a for-profit platform. And what we find is that a nonprofit platform can induce providers to increase their capacity. So a nonprofit platform can lead to capacity expansion. And that a nonprofit platform will increase the coverage in the market in cases where coordination capabilities is low and the market is still fairly profitable. So in a situation where there's a big profit potential for existing providers through coordination, so if the market is potentially very profitable, but it's very hard to coordinate existing providers, then a government-run platform will be extra valuable. In cases where it's easy to coordinate everyone, then of course, both of these types of platforms will be the same. But again, when coordination ability is intermediary and the market is profitable, that's where a government-run platform will shine. And then the question is, where are different markets here? We think that Kenya, for example, is not here. India potentially is in this region. Questions about this? Yeah.
Just as a means of comparison, a country like the United States or the UK or Germany, what do you have data on what the response rates are in those countries?
The response rates are 100%. Response times, oh, actually, there's regions in India that have a faster ambulance response time than Georgia because of especially in rural regions, simply because there's no hospitals around you. But yeah, but response times in most of the US is under 25 minutes or even under 10 minutes. So it's very unlikely in the US and most of Europe that you'll have to wait a substantial amount of time for an ambulance. Versus in India, we can't even estimate this data because most people don't even call emergency numbers to begin with. So if you interview patients, a lot of them even like you broke your leg, you usually won't call an ambulance. You'll just go with, you'll just take a Uber or rickshaw to a hospital. Okay, so let me move on to the last part. So the Platform Plus, what is the Platform Plus? The Platform Plus is a way to try to fill this remaining gap by not only coordinating existing providers, but also adding providers to the platform. This is what Stand Plus is doing. They're coordinating existing providers, but also trying to add some of their own providers to the platform. So again, what's going to be the game that we're going to play here? And my clicker is, okay, we're going to assume that the market is in equilibrium in the status quo. The entrepreneur will set up a platform to coordinate existing providers and might add or not a few ambulances. We're going to assume that the entrepreneur can place its ambulances wherever it wants. So its coverage is not necessarily the same as existing providers. It could be higher, it could be lower. And we're going to assume that it offers existing providers still a fraction of the revenue. And we're going to assume, which is a big assumption here, that providers, the platform will not prioritize its ambulances over other ambulances. Again, looking at the data of what these different companies do, there's no evidence that they prioritize their own ambulances, especially for emergencies. For non-emergencies, they might, but for emergencies, it's all about speed and fastest response.
By the way, do you always make a comparison between emergency and non-emergency?
Yeah, so here we're assuming emergency. Non-emergency would be a very different market.
Yeah, okay, so this is.
Yeah, non-emergency would be a completely different model. This is just for emergency. Yeah, non-emergency, I think it's a very different ballgame. Yeah, but it's also less of an urgent thing because if it's non-emergency, if people wait an hour, it's
So
it's not
all
critical.
the assumptions should have this urgency.
Yeah.
By heart.
Okay, so in this case, what we find is that in equilibrium, it's still optimal for the provider to attract everyone to the platform, for the platform to attract all providers to the platform, and also it sets the price in a way that none of the existing providers add more ambulances. However, if it's hard to coordinate the market or the market is not profitable enough, then the Platform Plus will invest in its own ambulances. So in this case, you can have ambulance expansion. So in the Platform Plus, no provider adds ambulances in the Platform Plus, but the platform might add ambulances when it can do so cheaply, or when the platform-owned ambulances can have a higher availability than existing ambulances, or when coordination is difficult. These are exactly situations that samplers are facing. So it makes sense what you're doing of adding their own ambulances, at least in terms of the forces. And also we can compare now the Platform Plus versus the government platform. And what we find is that in some situations, the Platform Plus actually leads to higher coverage than the government platform. So again, what I'm showing here is the coordination capability of the platform versus the market potential profitability. The brighter the color, the better the Platform Plus is. The darker, the better the government or nonprofit platform is. And what we see is that if the market is not profitable and coordination is difficult, then a government-run platform is better. Again, as the market becomes more and more profitable, you can actually have better coverage through a Platform Plus because of these additional ambulances that they're incentivized to add. Finally, how about existing providers? What we find is that existing providers are always worse off in any business model that an entrepreneur goes in, and by worse off, we mean that their profits go down, except in a government-run platform. So in a government-run platform would benefit providers, anything else would hurt providers. And this is a question about what happens in a lot of these developing countries, where a lot of these ambulance companies lobby against the government setting up their own platforms. And the result of this is that now you have these Uber for ambulances type platforms coming in. And in the end of the day, those type of platforms might hurt existing providers more than a government-run platform would. So again, food for thought about these things. So the takeaways, and then I'll wrap up the talk with one more thing, is that a free entry ambulance system provides limited coverage. So you have a cap on just a free market model for emergency response. This is probably the main takeaway of this paper, is that you won't be able to get high coverage in a free market setting for emergency coverage. You need to have some sort of better coordination or external intervention. For-profit platform gets you part of the way as long as it can coordinate existing providers. Non-profit platforms gets you even a little bit further and can lead to fleet expansions by existing providers. A Platform Plus, though, can kind of get potentially the best of both worlds as long as the government, as the market is profitable enough, except for providers. Providers are always in trouble, will lose profits for competition, for an existing provider coming in for a platform, unless there's a non-profit platform. Okay, so we got all of these ideas, we synthesized it into a few managerial insights. We showed it to a few companies, and this is what I want to spend the last couple of minutes in the talk talking about, is that this gave us entry to a few other companies, in specific Flare. Flare is like Stamp Plus, but based in Kenya. And we decided to engage with Flare doing more data-driven work. And this is work that I'm doing with Peter Vandenberg and Steph Lemons. Peter Vandenberg is a professor at Erasmus Rotterdam School of Management. He's the guy that designed the ambulance system in the Netherlands. So he really knows this stuff. So what is Flare? Flare is like Stamp Plus. It's the equivalent of, it's an Uber for ambulances in Nairobi. It also has over 300 ambulances on its platform. We're working with them to create a decision support tool to think about how they design incentives in the system. And the big challenge that we've been working with them for the last couple of years really is figuring out how can we get mobility data in Kenya. So mobility data in Kenya is very limited, but we were lucky to work with Uber and Facebook because we're using Uber data in Nairobi, for example, to estimate urban mobility, and Facebook data to assume demographic density in Nairobi. And just in a nutshell, to end with this, so yeah, so the data challenges are getting data, but luckily we can get high resolution data between different points in the city from Uber because we have data from Uber rides, and demographic data from Facebook. And okay, and the question that we're trying to address with Flare is that there's two types of ambulances, that there's two dimensions from a more operational level that ambulances vary on this platform. In terms of location committed, some ambulances can be willing to relocate or not. They can be willing to stay where you tell them to, if you think it's optimal for the system or not. And they vary also in terms of their temporal availability. Some ambulances, you know when they're available, and they're willing to commit to availability at a certain times, others do not. The target response time for Flare was 15 minutes within Nairobi, and we've been working with them developing various optimization models to think about what is the optimal distribution of ambulances. If there's one takeaway in 1 minute that I want to give from what we're learning here, is the following. So first of all, this is the demand data for emergencies in Nairobi. If you're familiar with Nairobi, this is more the central part of Nairobi. It's where most accidents, most emergencies happen. So the main takeaway from what we're learning is that there's a dramatic impact of commitment and central coordination in these systems. So for example, right now in Nairobi, Blair has about 340 ambulances in their network that are available around 25% of the time on average. The rest of the time they're doing non-emergency calls, they're not available. We can get the same coverage of these 340 ambulances with 75 location flexible, but not always available ambulances. So if we're able to get ambulances to commit to a location, we get the same coverage with 75 ambulances versus 340. If these ambulances are committed to be available at a certain time, we get the same coverage as these 340 ambulances with just 30 ambulances. And if ambulances are willing to be both location flexible and available 100% of the time, of course, no ambulance will be available 100% of the time, but just at the limit, if ambulances were always available, we wouldn't be able to get the same coverage that Blair has now with only 10 ambulances. So again, coordination and commitment can reduce by an order of magnitude the amount of resources that you need to cover in this case. In all these cases, are capturing 88% of the demand, which is what the fraction of demand they estimate they can get now. We're doing a separate project with Blair, also in Kakamega. This is a small rural county in Western Kenya. Using the same Facebook data to think about how can we allocate ambulances for maternal clinics. So there's a big issue with infant mortality and mortality of women when they're giving birth. And a lot of this is because they're giving birth into small clinics that can't handle complications. So we're also working on a project with how can we allocate ambulances in this county of Kakamega. So as a wrap up, so again, there's a lot of innovative sustainability related business models in low and medium income countries presenting promising research opportunities for our community. If you guys go into academia, I think the class project to start up to research paper pipeline can be productive. This is an example of such pipeline with Stampless. They started as a classroom project. I have a few other papers and projects with other companies. S-Smart is a company that also started in the classroom. They are a last mile distributor in India. We have a few papers with them. Insact and Pool. Insact is they produce fish feed for fisheries using black soldier flies. We also are working with them in a project or thinking about a project with them. Pool is another group of students that they created a carbon negative energy drink, also thinking about positive social impact. So I think this is a very productive space. And if you want to learn more about this or think about potential research projects, I encourage you to come tomorrow to the Sustainable X Showcase. So tomorrow we're going to have a pitch competition across the streets at Scheller at 4 p.m. where we're going to have 6 student teams here from Georgia Tech that are thinking about innovative business models that are both more sustainable and potentially more profitable than the status quo. That hopefully maybe someday can lead to research questions. Thank you guys. Thanks.